Hi, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. Today I'm back with cookies, naturally, but they're not the typical flat rolled decorated sugar cookie that I normally do. Instead, I'm going to be working with Tuiles. Tuiles are a very delicate and thin cookie that when pulled from the oven can be shaped while they're still hot into a variety of cool shapes. Today I'm going to be showing you Tuiles 3 different ways: fortune cookies, cones, and the cylinder wrap. But we're going to start with the basic recipe. Okay, what will you need for Tuiles? Not a lot. It's basically a 5-ingredient recipe, pretty simple. 6 or 7 ingredients if you count the salt and the additional flavorings. It starts with farm fresh eggs. I'm using 3 Springs Farm eggs. They're from my husband's farm. I just need 2 whites for this, so you can save the yolks for something else at room temperature, and that's important later. I'll talk about why. To those whites, we'll be adding superfine sugar, about 1/2 cup. It's important also to use superfine sugar because this is a quick mixing recipe. There's not going to be a lot of mixing and time to dissolve the sugar. So the finer it is to start, the smoother the batter you'll have and the more even baking tuile you'll end up with. Superfine sugar, it's called baker's sugar in some vernacular. This is how it comes in my grocery store in this big carton. You can also get smaller cartons of it. Once the eggs and sugar are blended together, we're going to be adding heavy cream. I've got 1½ tablespoons of that, also at room temperature. Melted but cooled butter. It's not solidified, but it isn't raging hot. And I've got 2½ tablespoons of that. If I've misspoken here, I'm going to have all the exact and proper proportions and measurements in the video description, so be sure to check that out. That's quickly blended, and finally we add flour in the proportions of about 1/2 cup and a little bit of salt to heighten flavor. In addition, you can add flavorings of your choice. I've got lemon, vanilla extract, almost anything will do. Typically, I'll add a 1/2 teaspoon to 2 teaspoons, depending on what the flavoring is, because each flavoring flavors with different intensity. You can also color the tuile batter, and we'll be doing that as well. So those are the ingredients for the recipe. For shaping the cookies are stenciled into the shapes and then folded. And for making the stencils, you'll need some acetate. I use a heavy gauge acetate. So it's a little bit thicker than what I use for royal icing transfers because I don't want it to be too floppy. I want it to have some durability. You can use cardboard as well, but I like to use acetate because I can rinse it off, clean it off, and then use it again later. And for cutting the acetate, you'll need a X-Acto knife and a ruler as a tracing guide. So I'm going to start with the first tuile, which will be these lovely cones. And that's going to make use of a triangular stencil. So what I want to show first is how to cut that stencil, and then we'll get into mixing the actual batter, because I like to use the batter almost as soon as it's mixed. So if you miss any of these details in the video, no worries, because these recipes are also in both of my books handily. The traditional tuile recipe, the plain vanilla one, is in Ultimate Cookies, and the cocoa version, which we'll be using for the fortune cookies, is in Cookie Swap. Now I'm going to make the stencil for the cone. It starts with a triangle. It's about 5 1/4 inches long and about 3 1/2 inches tall. You can use any size triangle. You'll just get a different cone depending on what you use. I start with that heavy gauge acetate I talked about, which is an 8 mil. And I've marked off my 5 1/4 inch line and a midpoint on that line. And I'm just going to connect the two to make the triangle 3 1/2 inches tall. Just tracing directly on the acetate. This acetate actually has a plastic covering on it that I can peel back later. So I'd like to trace on that so I don't get any marker on the acetate that's going to go directly against the food product. And then I just use a X-Acto knife to cut through the edges. I like to do this on a piece of cardboard on my cutting board so I don't cut into my cutting boards and scratch them all up. I like my cutting boards looking pretty good. This takes a few passes typically to get all the way through. If you hate cutting with a X-Acto knife, as I do, another option is to start it with a X-Acto knife. And then just once you've got some clearance, you can get in with your scissors and cut the rest of the sides. And sometimes I prefer to do that because I'm more clumsy with my X-Acto knife than I am with scissors. So that's also a possibility. But I do like to get one side open in order to do this. There we go. Simple stencil. And then at this point I would take off this outer covering because it's just going to come off when I wash the stencil anyway and get in the way when I spread the batter over it. Give this a rinse under warm water with soap, dry it completely before you use it, cut out any extraneous pieces that are stuck in the middle, and you're good to go. When you wash these, just note that The acetate will buckle under extremely hot water, so you can only use warm water and soap. If it's too hot, it'll buckle and bend, and then it won't lie flat, and it won't do its stenciling job properly. Okay, let's start putting the batter together. I've got my 2 egg whites, and they're at room temperature. And again, it's important to have them at room temperature. I didn't tell you why last time, but why is because we're using all room temperature ingredients. And if you have super cold egg whites and put lukewarm butter into them, what will happen is you'll end up with more of a curdly mixture. The temperature of the eggs, the coolness of the eggs will actually cause the butter to kind of coagulate. And you'll end up with a more lumpy batter, which will be harder to smooth, and it'll have the appearance of more bubbles when you bake it. So my eggs are at room temperature. It's really hard to break and separate room temperature eggs. So typically I'll separate them cold and then sit the egg whites in a little bigger bowl of warm water just to warm them up. Not really warm, they just should be body temperature. And we're gonna just add that 1/2 cup superfine sugar directly to the egg whites and just mix them till frothy. The other thing that's key with this recipe is I don't mix anything for very long, because if I beat the egg whites and sugar too long or beat the additional butter and cream in too long, I end up with a more frothy batter that's harder to spread, more bubbly, and it doesn't spread as evenly. So just a minute or 2 at each of these steps is sufficient. So till frothy on medium to medium-high speed. Now, given the quantity of sugar to egg white, this will never beat up into like peaks as you would with a meringue. It'll just get really thick and milky looking. So that's what I mean by frothy. I'm going to beat it a little bit longer and show you the camera more closely. So you'll notice when I pick up the beater, there's no egg white clinging to it. It's draining off, but it's very thick and kind of milky looking. And that's what you're looking for at this stage. No longer than that or you'll get too much air in it. With the mixer at medium speed, I'm going to be adding my cream, my 1½ tablespoons. And that melted but cooled butter. It's actually barely warm to the touch. And I'm just going to make sure all that butter gets in there nicely. And we're going to mix that again for maybe 30 seconds to a minute, just until it's a little bit thickened. Just barely, it might be a tad thicker. It's just very homogeneous looking, and that's what you're looking for. Now we're ready to add the 1/2 cup flour and the salt, touch of salt. I'm going to add the salt to the flour and add it all at once. And I just give this a spin on the mixer just to get it incorporated, and then I do a lot of hand mixing again to minimize the incorporation of air. And also to avoid toughening the batter, because I've added a bunch of flour at this point. So at this point it's partially mixed. I've still got a lot of flour on the edges. I'm going to do all the rest of my mixing by hand. This would also be the point at which you would add flavorings. I'm going to leave mine plain vanilla without any flavoring today, but I am going to color it a little bit. And to do that, I'm using my normal liquid gel food coloring that I use for coloring cookie icings. I typically add no more than 5 to 10 drops to this quantity of batter, because otherwise if you add too much, you materially affect the consistency of the batter and it doesn't bake the same way. But a few drops is usually enough to give it a slight tint. But different colors tint in different ways with different intensities. So with 3 drops of my Ivory Chef Master coloring, it's just making it kind of an off-white, kind of an antique white. And that's what I'm going for here. I'm going to add a couple more drops and that'll be it. But you'll see how smooth the batter is. Not too many bubbles, but very runny. That's why I'm not really calling it a dough, but a batter. So we're ready to start spreading the stencils. One note about pan preparation. I typically don't treat my silicone mats. I just spread directly on silicone when I have a new mat. I have been noticing though with some of my older mats that are very brown from use being in and out of the oven that they tend to have lost some of their non-stickiness, so they tend to stick more. So I have been spraying them with a little non-stick coating like Pam before spreading the tuile, just to make sure that the tuile comes off without tearing. And just as an extra safeguard, even though this is a brand new mat, I'm going to do the same thing. Just a light spritz of the Pam spray. And you see how it's all pooled up here. I really don't want that much on there. So I'm just going to wipe it off so it's just kind of like slightly greasy looking. And then we're ready to spread. Got my stencil. It's on the back of a sheet tray. I'm going to bake on the back of a sheet tray because it's just easier for me to pull everything off, the mat off, when I'm ready to shape it, as opposed to digging into the tray. But you want to make sure it's not hot because your stencil will, of course, melt if it is. And we'll take a little bit of the batter. I'm using a relatively big offset spatula so that I can cover that wide triangular area with one or two big spreads. So I just want to get coverage, and then you see how much there is on top. I want to basically spread it down so it's just the thickness of the stencil. You see how I've got some big open spots in it? I don't really like those, so I'm going to spread it till it's a little bit more smooth. And I think that looks pretty even. That's all I'm going to do. It's a little thicker at the top, but that should be okay. And then just kind of, I've got my hands anchoring the stencil on one side. I'm going to roll it off. And there's a little unevenness here on the edge. All that unevenness will tend to disappear when it bakes. So, and it'll even be more uneven. If I do a second stencil with this without cleaning the stencil, the edge will be even rougher. But usually that bakes away, so it's not so noticeable. I'll probably clean my stencil well, wash it under water and dry it every 3 or 4 times I use the stencil, but I don't do it every time. It's a little thin in this end here. You can see through it. So I'm going to put that end towards the oven door where it's cooler, and it may just bake a little more brown on that end, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, here it is, hot out of the oven. That was actually about 4.5 minutes in the oven, and it's starting to brown a lot on the side that's thinner. And I do want to roll it, get it off while it's hot. So just be careful not to touch the pan and shape it while it's hot. It will set in the matter of a couple of, less than a minute if your room is cool. And that's pretty good. What I'll do is it's still quite hot to touch, and it can unfold when it's hot to touch. So when I set it aside to cool, I'll set it aside on the seam so that it doesn't come apart at the seam. And when it's completely cool, I'll take it out of the mold so that it doesn't collapse. So we're going to let that cool and come back, and I'm going to show you how to fill it and some possible ways of presenting it. And then we'll get on to Tuile number 2, which is a fortune cookie. This is completely cool now. I can remove the metal form. If you're not going to fill these immediately, one thing to know about Tuiles is they're very thin. You can see it's like a piece of paper. And they're mostly sugar and egg white. So because they're sugar is hygroscopic. It attracts moisture from the environment. They're very humidity sensitive. It's a very humid day today, and it's hot in the studio. So if I were to leave this out for an hour, I think the whole thing would collapse. If they have wilted, you can always rewrap them around the form, put them back in the oven, briefly heat them, and take them out, and they'll set up again. So no worries there. I'm just going to fill mine with lemon mousse. I've got a nice star tip in here to give it some contour. I'm going to give it a nice little spiral on top. And where the icing broke, I'm going to stick one of these beautiful crystallized roses here. And I'll have the online source for these. I did not make these. I purchased these. They're just beautiful. You can candy your own rose petals, and those are beautiful garnish as well. And perhaps in a subsequent video, once the roses are in full bloom, I'll show you how to do that. Then for an individual size presentation, I've got a candlestick holder, which I think is just the right size for a little individual presentation. This could be kind of an amuse-bouche, if you will, dessert, a precursor to the big dessert. If this were at each person's plate, how beautiful that would be. On to Tuile shape number 2, the classic fortune cookie. Here it is in various folds. I forgot to put fortunes in these, but you can obviously slip a strip in as you're folding them, and I'll show you how to do that. If you're wondering why this Tuile batter is dark, it's because it's the cocoa version of my recipe, which is in my book Cookie Swap. I mentioned that early on. I am going to try these fortune cookies, though, with my plain batter here that I just mixed. Process would be identical. Bring it over the tray, shooting it with Pam again, or any other nonstick spray. wiping off the excess. And this time I'm working with a circular stencil. This is about 3 inches in diameter. I find that anything much bigger becomes a little harder to shape because the cookie tends to fall back in on itself as I fold it and flatten. So 3 inches creates that size right there, which is about 1.5 inches folded. So again, you don't need much batter. My cocoa batter recipe in Ultimate Cookies makes, or rather my cocoa version in Cookie Swap makes twice as much as the recipe in Ultimate Cookies. So just be aware of that. You can get a lot of fortune cookies out of the half batch that's in Ultimate Cookies. I think that's spread a little too thinly because I can see through it. So I'm going to just go over it a little more thickly. And that looks good. Lift off the stencil. And we're ready to stick that in the oven. I'm thinking it's going to be more like 4 minutes. The last one was 4.5 minutes, and this is a little bit smaller, but we'll keep an eye on it. Okay, so that was about 5 minutes, believe it or not, but I'm looking less so for the exact time in the oven as opposed to light browning around the edges. If it's not browned, then it's probably going to flop back on itself. So I lift it off, get it off the sheet. I like to shape on the cookie sheet because it's hot and it gives me longer shaping time and the ability to talk longer. Folding it in half into a half cylinder and then a half circle rather. Then putting my forefinger here and pulling back on the 2 outer edges. And I've got a nice little fortune cookie shape with the fortune nestled inside and peeking out, which I kind of like the hint of it showing. Our third and final shape is this gorgeous stenciled Tuile cup in which I've got cake and icing. So this is a slight variation because I'm shaping it as a cylinder as opposed to a cone or a fortune cookie, but it's also stenciled with a mixture of cocoa powder and powdered sugar. So for this piece, the key thing is to make sure you cut a stencil. This is a little hard to see, but you want to cut a stencil that's long enough to go around whatever you're shaping it around. This is about a 2 3/4 inch diameter cylinder, and so I have cut this, I believe, about 8.5 inches long, but I'll have the exact dimensions in the video description, and then just cut it as high as you want the cylinder. This is about 2 3/4 inches high, I believe. So it makes a nice sort of cupcake liner size. So once again, we want to treat our silicone mat with a little bit of Pam. Make sure this really comes off. And you'll see I've done some versions of these and the pictures floating by that have pink backgrounds. I simply tinted the TUILE batter pink as opposed to this taupe color. The first step is actually spreading the batter through the stencil, and then we're going to stencil on top of the spread batter. I moved it off the cookie sheet for this step because the cocoa stencil is going to extend possibly beyond the silicone mat, so I need it to be sitting on the counter as well. So just spreading as thin as the thickness of the stencil itself. This one's a little harder to spread completely evenly without bubbles in it, but that's okay. Any kind of bubbles will tend to smooth out in the baking process. That looks pretty good to me. Now I'm just going to lift that off. And now we want to stencil it around it. I've cut a window, which is basically the dimensions of the batter here, taped my stencil to it, the yellow part. And we're just going to be sifting through the yellow part to create the pattern. But I need to prop the stencil up so it doesn't flop, which is where these cardboards come in handy. And then I'm just going to lay this on top and center it over the piece that I just spread. So now you'll see that the yellow stencil is kind of hovering over that TUILE batter, but not in it. You could potentially airbrush through here. I've never tried that. I've usually had most success with stenciling with some mixture of cocoa powder, unsweetened cocoa powder, and powdered sugar. Today I'm using a ratio of 3 parts powdered sugar to 1 part unsweetened cocoa powder. If you were to use the cocoa powder directly all by itself, you get a really dark stencil, which can be pretty, but it is bitter. So I do like to mix it with a little bit of powdered sugar, not only to lighten the color, but also to sweeten it a little bit. And I'm putting it through a very fine mesh sieve because I don't want it dumping in any areas heavily. I just want a real light but even sifting over the top. And I'm looking down overhead to make sure that it's pretty even. Now it's going to appear pretty pale on the batter at first, but as it bakes, that sugar will dissolve and there'll be some caramelization that occurs and the whole pattern will turn darker than it appears. So have no fear if it looks super light. It will be darker. That's why I mix it with quite a lot of powdered sugar. Otherwise it's very, very dark. And now at this stage you want to very carefully lift up this stencil so that it doesn't mess up the tuile batter underneath. And so you don't dump any of that extra cocoa powder on top of that beautiful pattern. You can see how nice that looks. Now this goes into the oven. Obviously we want to remove these supports. And I can simply slide it on the silicone mat onto the back side. That's why I like to work on the back side of a cookie sheet and put it directly into the oven. But do so carefully. If you bounce the tray, you can bounce the cocoa powder on top and mess up your design. But that's what it looks like going into the oven, and it'll darken substantially when it comes out. There it is, out of the oven. Just light browning around the edges is an indicator to me that it's probably not too sticky anywhere. And then I have my cylinder ready. Again, doing a lot of the shaping while it's kind of close to the heat. And I'll just kind of roll it onto the cylinder without lifting it too much because it's super hot until I get to the end. It's still warm. I want to make sure I can disengage the cylinder and it's still somewhat loose so I can get the cylinder out, because when it cools it can stick to the cylinder. You'll notice the pattern got a lot darker. There's still some unmelted cocoa powder, some of that mixture that we dusted on top, we stenciled on top. And I'm going to actually brush that off with a brush, but I only want to do that once this is cooled. If I brush it while it's warm, I can smudge the pattern. So we're going to give that a couple minutes, then I'll brush it off and you'll see even more of the pattern emerge. So we're ready to plate this up. A number of ways, things you could do. As I mentioned before, the seam is loose in the back, so I can purposely get the cylinder out. If you want to secure it with a little buttercream or royal icing so that it doesn't open up, you can do that. But this is the kind of thing where you want to serve it, you want to plate it and fill it right before service because the cookie will get soft, much as the cones will. So I've got my cake all ready to go. If you're not going to serve it right away, store it in an airtight container. Before we actually take the cylinder off, though, I just want to talk to you about the pattern. You know, I mentioned before that there's still a light dusting of the dry powder on there. And now that the cookie's cool, I can take a dry pastry brush and knock off that excess to reveal more of the pattern. And I think that's quite nice as well. Either effect is kind of nice. But there it just looks a little bit more distinct with it brushed off. Now I am going to fill this with cake. I find it's easiest to get the cake inside by pre-cutting the rounds to the right diameter. And this is just a white cake filled with my Italian buttercream. I've got a whole video about how to make my Italian buttercream. And I'm going to fill it with a cocoa or chocolate rather flavored version of that buttercream. Top it off, I should say. It's filled with a plain version of it. But I like this. I think the dark icing will look really nice. It'll tie in the dark pattern on the stencil quite nicely. That just looks really luscious. And to top it off, I'm going to use one of those beautiful crystallized roses that we used on the cones, but I'm going to use a much bigger one. Just want to place it maybe right like so. And that makes a spectacular cupcake. Or elegant mini cake, if you will. So those are Tuile's 3 ways. We covered cones made with a triangular stencil, fortune cookies made with a round stencil, and the cylindrical stenciled shape made with a rectangular stencil and an additional stenciling of cocoa powder and powdered sugar on top. In my next video, I'm going to talk about taking the Tuiles up a notch and combining them with meringues to make an ice cream cone cookie that will be perfect for summer parties. Till next video, live sweetly.